Now, tell me some of the highlights of your service in the Navy. I'm sure when Pearl Harbor happened, you were worried.
Let me tell you, my service in the Navy, and we can get around the details of this later, but all my work in the Navy was intelligence. That started out strictly by accident, but I continued to work in intelligence for my entire Navy career, and every day was a highlight. Every day was a highlight.
You loved your
I
job.
loved it.
Wow. How did you, by accident, get into intelligence?
Well, my training at Northwestern trained me as what the Navy called a deck officer, and most of my classmates went to ships. But just by the luck of the draw, and I call it luck, I was assigned to an intelligence office in Seattle, Washington, for further training as an investigator. Naval Intelligence had to investigate people who were going to be given security clearances and find out if they were loyal Americans and things like that. So I got an additional 6 weeks of training as an investigator, but I never did any investigative work. Instead, during the next few months in Seattle, I did some public relations work for the Navy, and but when the war started, as soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, I was given orders to go to Pearl Harbor, and when I got there, I was interviewed by the intelligence officer at Pearl Harbor, and his first question to me was, "What investigative?" I was sent as an investigator. He said, "What investigative experience have you had?" And I said, "None, except for the training." And he said, "Well, you're no good to me. I need people with experience," as indeed he did. But he says, "I have a billet out at the Navy Yard that I'm supposed to fill. I'm supposed to send someone. I've never been able to spare someone, but I'm going to spare you." So the next morning I reported to Commander Joseph Rochfort, who you've probably not heard of, but a book is currently being written about him and his exploits in the Navy. He became fairly famous because he was a very well-known Japanese codebreaker, Japanese linguist and codebreaker for the U.S. Navy during World War II. And without any prior knowledge or without any training, I was suddenly working in the shop where they were breaking the Japanese code. This was in February of 1942, after the war had started. And I was put to work. I was not a linguist. I was not a cryptographer. I was a budding intelligence officer. And my job then was to take the Japanese messages that they were working on and derive from them and interpret as necessary the intelligence that would be useful to Admiral Nimitz, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. And so I was an intelligence analyst, and I stayed there in that shop for 3 years, all of the rest of 1942, 43, and 44. And we provided a lot of intelligence, a lot of very useful intelligence to Admiral Nimitz to conduct the war against the Japanese. And in January 1945, the fleet intelligence officer on Admiral Nimitz's staff was going to move to Guam with the Admiral when he set up an advanced headquarters, and he asked me to go along as his assistant. We had become good friends during that time, and I welcomed that, and so I was detached from the radio intelligence unit, and I went on the staff of Admiral Nimitz for the last 8 months of the war at the advanced headquarters in Guam, and that's where I was when the war ended, when the Japanese surrendered.
So the code that you broke, you said helped turn the war to the Americans' favor, right?
That was the Battle of Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy, was not in favor of going to war with the United States. He had formerly been the naval attaché in Washington, D.C. for Japan, and he knew the United States. He had traveled around the United States. He knew that we were an industrial giant with great capability, couldn't be matched by Japan, and he told his superiors in Japan, he said, if you go to war with the United States, he said, and I have to participate in it for the Navy. He was by then commander-in-chief of the Japanese Navy. He says, I can guarantee you success for 6 months. After that, I can't guarantee you anything, because you will have awakened a sleeping giant. That was his words. Well, they attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941. And the Battle of Midway occurred in the first week of June, 1942. 6 months to the day. And at the Battle of Midway, which we had intercepted all of the Japanese planning messages for the Battle of Midway. We knew what they were doing. They didn't know that we knew. We didn't have very many ships. Admiral Nimitz didn't have very many ships to meet this big Japanese fleet that was going to attack Midway and occupy Midway and set up a base at Midway from which they could attack Pearl Harbor by air from the base at Midway. It was a vital base and one that we had to stop. So Admiral Nimitz devised a plan where he would keep his aircraft carriers undetected until the Japanese had commenced their attack on Midway, which we knew they were going to do. And as soon as they attacked Midway on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, our planes were launched against the Japanese fleet. The Japanese didn't know we were even there. They didn't know we knew about them. And within 20 minutes, we had sunk 3 of their 4 aircraft carriers, and then later that day, we sank the 4th one. This destroyed all of their aircraft carriers. It destroyed all the planes that were on those carriers and the pilots that were flying the plane. It was a total loss to the Japanese. And that was their best trained pilots, their biggest carriers. Same carriers, same pilots that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. And now they had lost them all. And the Admiral Yamamoto had no choice but at the end of that day to call off the operation and return to Japan. And that is considered historically to be the turning point of the war in the Pacific, because after that the Japanese were never able to mount a major offensive action. They did bits and pieces, and they defended themselves against some of our landings and so forth. But we then started doing our recapturing of the areas that the Japanese had captured, and just 2 months after Midway, we went into Guadalcanal, and that was the beginning of what we called our island hopping campaign that worked closer and closer during the war toward Japan and ended up with Okinawa. And we were planning to occupy Japan when the Japanese finally surrendered after we used the atomic bomb. 2 atomic bombs.
Yeah.
And all the time, the last 8 months of the war, when Iwo Jima and Okinawa were being captured and we were planning for the invasion of Japan, I was on the staff of Admiral Nimitz on Guam, and it was pretty heady duty.
What
Big
was
duty.
that day like? I mean, what was a day like? I mean, were you just...
But it started out at 9 o'clock every morning, 7 days a week, with me giving an intelligence briefing to Admiral Nimitz and his staff. And that was the good part of the day, and then it got better. It was wonderful. Admiral Nimitz was a
Good man?
real gentleman, a very capable commander, and I've told people I don't think we would have won the war if we hadn't had anyone other than Admiral Nimitz as our commander.
So he took in what you were saying and then had to made his plans based on the intelligence.
He appreciated intelligence.